When I first met Mr. Adrian, he was 68 years old, a retired history teacher who had always prided himself on living simply. He still wore the same thick-rimmed glasses from his younger years, and his gentle way of speaking reminded me of the patient man who had guided countless students through exams and essays. But that day, his voice trembled when he told me about something that had been bothering him. He held out his hand, showing me small white specks on his fingernails, and whispered almost like a confession, "I think my body is failing me." It wasn't just the nails. Adrian admitted that for weeks his heels had been cracking so badly that he had to put socks on even at home, just to hide the pain from his grandchildren. He spoke of the nights when his legs cramped so fiercely he would sit at the edge of the bed, rocking himself back and forth in the dark, waiting for the sharpness to pass. His wife had noticed too. "He doesn't laugh as much anymore," she told me softly, "and lately he avoids the mirror because he says his eyes look tired and yellow." For a man who had always been strong and steady, these little changes shook him to the core. I told him something many seniors never hear. The body often whispers before it screams. Those whispers, the nails, the cracks, the cramps, were not random misfortunes. They were quiet signals, hints of deeper imbalances inside him. Adrian stared at me for a long moment, as if he had been waiting years for someone to put the pieces together. You see, it wasn't about blaming age or fate. It was about listening, really listening to the language of his own body. That day became the turning point for Adrian. I watched as his worry slowly shifted into curiosity. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he began to wonder, "What is my body trying to tell me?" He didn't need a complicated lecture or thick medical books. What he needed was a gentle reminder that his body was still on his side, that every ache, every mark, every restless night was a message meant to guide him. In the weeks that followed, Adrian began a quiet transformation. He sat in the sunlight a little longer each morning, letting its warmth reach him not just on the skin, but in his spirit. He rediscovered the comfort of real food, the kind his grandmother once cooked with care, food that nourished rather than filled. And most importantly, he found hope again. Hope that strength could return, that energy could flow back, and that the years ahead did not have to be defined by decline. I share Adrian's story because so many of us ignore the whispers until they turn into shouts. We cover the cracks with creams, we hide the fatigue with coffee, we explain away the sadness as just age. But if we pause long enough, if we dare to notice, we will see what Adrian saw, that the body is wiser than we think. It doesn't betray us, it tries to teach us. And the moment we begin to understand its language, the path toward healing becomes clear, simple, and deeply human. So, as we begin this journey together, I want you to picture Adrian not as a patient, but as a mirror. His story is not unique. It belongs to countless men and women who wake up every day with small signs they cannot name. And just as Adrian found his way back to strength, so can you. This isn't about fear. It's about discovery. It's about learning, gently and without judgment. The 23 quiet signs your body may be waiting for you to notice. The first time Ryker truly admitted something was wrong, it wasn't to me or even to his wife, Clara. It happened alone in the middle of the night. He woke with a start, his calves knotted so tightly it felt like a fist had clamped down on his muscles. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, pressing his feet hard onto the floorboards, willing the pain to stop. The room was dark except for the soft blue glow of the streetlight through the curtains. He didn't want to wake Clara, but she stirred anyway, whispering his name. "Ryker? Another cramp?" He nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. By morning, the cramp had passed, but the fear hadn't. Clara brewed his usual coffee, but her eyes lingered on him longer than usual. She had noticed the change in him, the way he winced when bending down to tie his shoes, how he gripped the railing a little tighter when going down the stairs. "You used to carry the grandkids on your shoulders without a thought," she teased softly, though her smile was tinged with worry. Ryker chuckled, but deep down, the thought gnawed at him. What if this is how the rest of my life will feel? Smaller, weaker, and full of little pains that steal my joy piece by piece? Later that week, during his visit, I listened as he recounted the restless nights. His words were slow, almost reluctant, as if speaking them aloud made them more real. I leaned back in my chair and told him gently, "Ryker, your body isn't betraying you. It's asking you for something it doesn't have enough of." He looked at me, puzzled, so I explained it in a way I hoped would feel less clinical. You know how a tree droops when it hasn't had enough water? That's what muscles do when they lack certain minerals. One of the most important is magnesium. It helps them relax. It keeps them from seizing up. Without it, the night feels heavier, more restless. Ryker sat quietly for a moment, absorbing this. Magnesium, he repeated softly, almost tasting the word as if it were a foreign language. He thought of his diet: toast, coffee, the occasional sandwich, dinners that were often more about convenience than nourishment. The truth was, he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a big bowl of leafy greens or savored the crunch of fresh vegetables. Clara did her best, but he often pushed the salad aside, joking that rabbit food wasn't for him. Now he wondered if those small choices had finally caught up to him. The turning point came one afternoon when his grandson, Daniel, asked him to play tag in the yard. Ryker tried, but within minutes, his legs felt heavy, uncooperative. He leaned against the fence, pretending to catch his breath while Daniel ran off laughing. Clara watched from the porch, her expression soft but concerned. That evening, she placed a bowl of spinach on the dinner table. "For me?" Ryker asked, raising an eyebrow. She smiled knowingly. "For us." He didn't argue. For the first time, he looked at the simple greens not as an obligation, but as a lifeline, a way back to the man he used to be. Over the next few weeks, Ryker made small but meaningful shifts. He added a handful of greens to his plate, sometimes blending them into soups so they felt less daunting. Clara began making a warm spinach and mushroom sauté he actually looked forward to. And gradually he noticed the nights changing. The cramps came less often. The restless jolts of pain eased. He woke with a little more peace, a little less fear. It wasn't a miracle, but it was hope. And hope, he realized, was the most powerful medicine of all. That night, lying in bed beside Clara, he whispered, "Maybe my body's not done teaching me yet." She reached for his hand in the dark, giving it a squeeze. And for the first time in months, Ryker fell asleep without the dread of waking up in pain. His journey had begun not with a cure, but with a conversation, with his body, with Clara, and with himself. On a late morning when the house was quiet, Ryker sat by the window with a small nail file and a mug of warm tea. Sunlight poured across the table, and that's when he noticed them again, tiny white flecks scattered on 2 fingernails, like snow that refused to melt. He rubbed his thumb over them as if the marks would fade with enough patience. Instead, a memory surfaced: the birthday last month, the thick frosting, the second slice he hadn't planned to take. He sighed, set the mug down, and called me, not to ask for a lecture, but to ask for a translation of what his body was trying to say. When Ryker arrived at my office, he carried that same quiet resolve I recognized from men who have decided to change without fanfare. We talked about how sweetness can be a small thief, how it sneaks in to give a burst of joy and leaves with something we need more. I told him there's a mineral that steadies the body's small repairs and quiets certain restless signals, and that too much sugar crowds it out. He nodded, eyes fixed on his hands, the way a man looks at tools he hasn't cared for in a while. "So this isn't vanity," he said softly. "It's a message." Back home, Ryker and Clara made a game of rearranging their kitchen. The cookie tin went to the top shelf, out of easy reach, replaced by a clear jar of roasted pumpkin seeds that caught the light each time the cupboard opened. On the counter, Clara set a small plate with hard-boiled eggs and a pinch of sea salt, simple and satisfying in a way that felt honest. Twice a week, the house carried the soft ocean scent of sardines warming in the pan, and Ryker joked that dinner sounded like a tide rolling in. He kept a tiny tin of seeds in his jacket pocket, the new ritual for when the old cravings came calling. A few days later, at Daniel's weekend soccer game, the smell of fried dough and cinnamon drifted across the field like a memory. His grandson ran up, waving a sugar-dusted donut, smiling with the kind of generosity children have in abundance. "Grandpa, want a bite?" Ryker's answer surprised even himself. He laughed, opened his little tin, and poured a few seeds into his palm. "Trade you for crunch," he said. And they ate side by side, crumbs for him, seeds for Ryker, both of them happy with the rhythm they'd found. When he clapped from the sidelines, he felt a different kind of energy, quieter, steadier, unbragging. Of course, change rarely moves in a straight line. At his friend's retirement party, someone handed Ryker a plate with a generous slice of chocolate sheet cake, the kind that tastes like memory and celebration. He finished it before he remembered the promise he'd made to himself, and that night his sleep felt choppy, his mind flickering with old dreams. In the morning, he noticed a pale fleck near the edge of a nail, as if the body had left a small, polite note. He didn't scold himself. He placed the plate in the sink, washed it clean, and poured a glass of water as if to begin again. At our next visit, I told him what I tell every patient who learns to listen. We grow by returning. He told me about the kitchen jar and the tin in his pocket, about the donut he'd turned down and the cake he hadn't. We decided to put sweetness where it belongs, in time, not in every hour, choosing one day for dessert, a ritual wrapped in patience. On Sundays, Clara baked an apple dish with cinnamon and a whisper of honey, served warm enough to fog the window over the sink. They ate slowly, not as people escaping the week, but as people honoring it. Weeks later, Ryker held his hands to the same window where this part of the story began. The specks had softened, one almost gone, the other smaller, like a cloud that had decided to drift on. He could feel the difference before he could see it, a steadiness in the afternoons, a quiet pride when he reached for the jar instead of the tin on the shelf. This wasn't punishment, it was permission to choose, to begin again, to let the body speak and to answer with kindness. Clara slipped her hand into his and the house breathed with them. The whispers were quieter now, and in their place came a kind of music only the honest heart can hear. It was a cold morning when Ryker noticed the sting at the corners of his mouth. He thought little of it at first, assuming it was the dry air, but each time he smiled or sipped tea, the small cracks tugged painfully, reminding him they were still there. Clara frowned when she saw him wince during breakfast. "You hide it, but I see it," she said, her voice threaded with concern. He tried to brush it off, calling it just winter lips, but deep down the quiet ache unsettled him. The man who once laughed freely now pressed his lips tight, as if sealing away the discomfort along with his joy. When Ryker came to see me, he carried that unease in the slump of his shoulders. I asked him to tell me about his meals, and he confessed that breakfast was often toast with butter, lunch a sandwich, dinner a quick plate of pasta or rice. "Real food feels too much work," he admitted, shaking his head as though embarrassed by the truth. I explained softly that the cracks weren't a sign of weakness, but of something missing, a kind of nourishment his body had been quietly asking for. Your skin, your smile, they're made from the smallest parts of what you eat. When something is missing, even the simplest expressions remind you. That evening, Clara placed a small jar of golden powder on the table. "Nutritional yeast," she announced with a sparkle in her eye as if she were presenting treasure. She sprinkled it over warm vegetables, stirring gently until the kitchen filled with a nutty aroma. Ryker raised an eyebrow but tasted it anyway. To his surprise, it carried a comforting flavor, rich and almost cheesy, a warmth he hadn't expected. He finished his plate slowly, not because of duty, but because each bite felt like something his body had been waiting for. Over the next week, Clara began slipping the powder into soups and sauces, disguising it in ways that made meals feel familiar rather than foreign. Ryker found himself lingering at the table, savoring food that once seemed ordinary. One afternoon, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror as he laughed at something Daniel said, and for the first time in weeks, the smile stretched without pain. The cracks had softened, nearly healed. He pressed a finger to the corner of his mouth, marveling at the simple gift of a smile unchained by ache. But the shift wasn't only in his lips. Something quieter stirred inside him, a reminder that his body was still capable of repair, of renewal. He began to see meals not as chores, but as conversations with himself. When Clara served a warm stew one rainy evening, he held the bowl close, breathing in its comfort, and thought, maybe health isn't about doing everything right. Maybe it's about answering when the body calls. He didn't need grand changes, just the willingness to notice and to respond with patience. A week later, Ryker shared a small victory with me. "I laughed yesterday," he said simply, his eyes bright. Not the careful kind, not the half smile, a real laugh. And it didn't hurt. I nodded, knowing the cracks on his lips had carried more than physical pain. They had mirrored his hesitation, his worry that age meant a slow unraveling. But with each bite of something nourishing, each softened smile, he was stitching back not just his skin, but his sense of self. Clara noticed it too, how his jokes returned, how the house felt lighter when he laughed. And so, what began as tiny cracks at the corners of his mouth became something larger, a doorway back into joy. Ryker understood now that even the smallest signals from the body deserved to be heard. Each healing line reminded him that renewal is possible at any age, not through perfection, but through attention. And with that, he leaned closer to the man he still wanted to be, not defined by discomfort, but by the laughter he shared freely with the people he loved. It happened on a rainy evening, the kind when the roads shine like mirrors and the headlights stretch into blurs. Ryker was driving home from visiting an old friend when he realized he was squinting harder than usual. Each raindrop on the windshield seemed to swallow the light, and the street signs appeared softer, harder to read. When he pulled into the driveway, Clara noticed how tightly he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. "You look shaken," she said, her hand brushing his arm. He hesitated before admitting, "It's the night. I can't see in it the way I used to." The truth weighed on him more than he expected. For a man who had driven his children to school in the early dawn, who had spent years commuting under streetlights, losing confidence behind the wheel felt like losing a piece of independence. That night, over a quiet dinner, Clara encouraged him to talk about it. "It's not weakness to notice," she whispered. "It's wisdom." But Ryker didn't want pity, he wanted clarity. So he came to me not as a patient seeking medicine, but as a man seeking understanding. When he described the hazy shapes, the way darkness swallowed the details, I explained softly that the eyes, too, ask for nourishment. There's a particular vitamin, one found in yolks, liver, the richness of the sea, that sharpens the eyes when shadows grow long. Ryker leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugging at him. "Egg yolks?" he asked, almost amused. "After all these years of avoiding them, thinking they'd harm me?" I nodded, reminding him that sometimes the foods we fear are the ones that quietly hold us together. Clara wasted no time. The next morning, the kitchen carried the aroma of scrambled eggs sizzling in butter, the yolks bright as the rising sun. She slid the plate in front of Ryker, her eyes daring him to refuse. He didn't. The first bite was rich, smooth, and unexpectedly comforting. Over the days that followed, Clara introduced small changes, adding a spoonful of cod liver oil to their morning routine, serving tender slices of beef liver on Sunday, dishes Ryker had nearly forgotten from his childhood. Each meal became more than sustenance. It became a gesture of trust, of hope stitched into the fabric of everyday life. Weeks later, Ryker found himself on the same rainy road, hands steady this time. The lights no longer blurred into formless halos, the signs spoke clearly again, even through the drizzle. He pulled into the driveway with a quiet triumph and told Clara, "It felt like the road gave itself back to me." Her smile said more than words ever could. It wasn't just about sight, it was about freedom, the reassurance that he could still move through the world with confidence. At our next visit, Ryker shared his small victory, his voice steady, almost proud. I told him what I tell everyone who discovers renewal. The body never stops asking, but it also never stops responding. He nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and wonder. For him, the flicker in the dark had become more than a warning. It had become an invitation to look closer, to nourish more deeply, and to believe that clarity, once thought lost, could still be reclaimed. That night, as he sat with Clara on the porch, the twilight settling around them, he whispered, "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore." And in that moment, the darkness wasn't an enemy, but a companion, softened by the light of a man learning once more to see. It began as a dull heaviness, a small knot beneath Ryker's right ribcage that came and went like an unwelcome guest. At first, he ignored it, telling Clara it was probably indigestion or something he ate too quickly. But on certain evenings, as he eased into his armchair, the ache would creep into his shoulder and tighten the muscles along his back. One afternoon, while trimming roses in the yard, the discomfort flared so sharply he had to stop and press his hand against his side. Clara noticed from the kitchen window and hurried out, her voice trembling. "Ryker, what is it?" He tried to wave her worry away, but the truth lingered in his silence. When he told me about it, his tone carried both fear and resignation. "It's like something is stuck," he explained. I nodded, listening, then asked him if he remembered how clogged pipes sound in an old house. He chuckled softly, though his eyes betrayed the weight of unease. I told him the body works much the same way, that the liver and gallbladder, when overburdened, can cause a kind of backup, a heaviness that radiates into the shoulder and back. "It's not your age betraying you," I said gently. "It's your body asking for a clearer path." Back at home, Clara decided to make subtle changes. Fried foods and heavy oils gave way to lighter meals, and she placed a small bottle of something new on the counter, purified bile salts, recommended during our conversation. At first, Ryker eyed it skeptically, but Clara reminded him of the roses outside, how the soil must be loosened, how water must flow freely for the roots to thrive. "Maybe your body is just another garden," she whispered, and so he tried. The shift was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. Within days, the ache beneath his ribs softened. He found himself moving with less hesitation, even bending easily to pick up Daniel's soccer ball without the shadow of pain. At dinner one evening, he remarked that his shoulders felt lighter, freer, as though someone had untied a knot he hadn't realized was binding him. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes moist with quiet relief. "I have my Ryker back," she said, and though he laughed, the words sank into him like a balm. A week later, while visiting me again, Ryker shared a simple but profound observation. "Doctor," he said, "it's not just the pain that's gone, it's the worry. I don't sit waiting for it anymore." That to me was the true transformation. It wasn't only his body that had been relieved, but his spirit. The absence of pain had given him back not just comfort, but presence, space to laugh, to garden, to live without that shadow pressed beneath his ribs. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room in amber light, Ryker leaned against Clara on the couch. He whispered something she later told me. "I didn't know how heavy it was until it lifted." And that is often the way of healing. It feels impossible until the moment it quietly arrives, like the breath you didn't know you were holding, released at last. The winter days were growing shorter when Clara first noticed a heaviness in Ryker's eyes. It wasn't just tiredness, he had known fatigue before, but a dimness that settled in him like a shadow that refused to lift. He moved more slowly through the house, his laughter rarer, his evenings quieter. When Daniel asked him to read a story aloud, Ryker managed a few pages before closing the book, saying softly, "Maybe tomorrow, kiddo." Clara sat beside him that night, her hand on his arm, and whispered, "You're here, but it feels like part of you has gone somewhere else." When Ryker came to see me, he didn't try to disguise it. "It's not pain this time," he said quietly. "It's something inside, like my spirit has gone gray." I leaned closer, speaking not as a physician, but as a man who understood that the mind and body are not strangers. "Ryker," I said, "sometimes what feels like the heart is simply the body asking for sunlight it hasn't had. It's not weakness, it's a reminder." He nodded slowly, as if the word reminder gave him permission to hope that this fog wasn't permanent. Clara took my words to heart. She began opening the curtains wider in the mornings, letting the pale sun pour into their kitchen. On days when the sky was kind, she coaxed him outside, wrapping a scarf around his neck and handing him a cup of tea to sip on the porch. At first, Ryker resisted, his body heavy with reluctance, but soon he found the quiet warmth of daylight seeping into him. He started to notice small things again, the sound of sparrows in the hedges, the way the frost melted in silver lines across the lawn. One evening, Clara prepared a meal richer in color than he had seen in months. Roasted salmon brushed with olive oil, golden sweet potatoes, and greens that shimmered in garlic. She placed a small amber bottle on the table, offering him a supplement she had picked up after our talk. "A drop of sunlight for the days when the sky forgets us," she said. Ryker took it, almost reluctantly, but later that night, he told her he felt a softness in his chest, as though the shadows had thinned just slightly. It wasn't an instant transformation, but slowly the weight began to lift. The mornings grew brighter, not just outside the window, but within him. He began humming again while trimming the roses, and when Daniel tugged at his sleeve one Saturday, he not only read the story, but added voices for the characters, sending his grandson into fits of laughter. Clara listened from the kitchen, her eyes filling with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. When Ryker returned to my office weeks later, his eyes carried light again. He sat straighter, his voice more certain, and said simply, "I thought it was the end of joy, but it was only the end of ignoring myself." His words lingered with me long after he left because they carried the truth I wish more people would see. The body speaks in shadows as well as light, and healing often begins not in grand cures, but in the quiet willingness to listen. That night, as the sun dipped and the first stars appeared, Ryker and Clara sat together on the porch, sharing a blanket. He lifted his face toward the fading glow and said softly, "It feels good to be here again." And in that simple moment, he was not just healed, he was home, fully present in the life he had almost forgotten was his to live. When I think back on Ryker's path, I see a man who began in fear, startled awake by cramps in the night, burdened by tiny cracks and white specks that seemed to whisper of decline. He once believed these were signs of age pulling him downward, but what he discovered was far more powerful. They were not punishments, but invitations. With each small step, adding the quiet strength of leafy greens to his plate, choosing seeds over sweets, letting sunlight return to his mornings, Ryker found that his body was still capable of mending, still eager to guide him back toward balance. Clara noticed the difference long before he fully believed it himself. She saw the light return to his laughter, the confidence in his stride when he played with Daniel, the relief in his shoulders when the ache beneath his ribs no longer held him captive. These weren't miracles, they were choices, gentle choices repeated patiently that gave him back not only his health but also his presence, the gift of being fully here in his own life with the people who loved him most. Ryker's story is not so different from our own. The body speaks softly through cracks, through shadows, through weariness we often dismiss as just age. But if we pause long enough to listen, to answer those whispers with kindness, we may find that healing is closer than we think. It begins not with grand cures or complicated regimens, but with attention, with noticing, and then responding one small act at a time. So tonight, as you sit quietly in your own space, I hope Ryker's journey reminds you of this truth. Your body has not given up on you. It is still speaking, still teaching, still waiting for you to listen. And when you do, life has a way of feeling whole again,